Hi everyone, welcome to Type Talks. Today we're here with Dario Nardi, and we're here to discuss the cognitive function stack of the INFJ and the INTJ, but in a nuanced way. And so Dario Nardi has an assessment called the CPA, and he collected a lot of information on people's cognitive function stackings. And he saw that every type had two variations of cognitive functions that showed up in the data. And this is also verified by other people who also have cognitive function assessments. They come to the same conclusion as Dario has as well. And so we're here today to unpack those results and so that you can learn a little bit more about what the data says. So, Dario, would you like to tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So the CPA, or Cognitive Processes Assessment, a lot of people over almost 20 years have been taking it at keystocognition.com. We have collected a huge amount of data, over 200,000 unique records, not just the person selecting submit, unique records. And then my colleague, Dr. Mina Barmani, a professor at Johns Hopkins University, and her colleagues have been doing statistical analysis with it. And the assessment is not your usual like A or B around the Myers-Briggs preferences. It's actually not a Myers-Briggs assessment at all. It's purely Jungian functions, so that every question is like one of the functions. Or it could actually be some of them or two of the functions together, but we're not counting that in our analysis that we're talking about today. And people just rank them in terms of their skilled use. So it's a picture of development, and people will get, after they submit it, like a ranking or stacking of the 8 functions and what that looks like for them, like a bar chart. And we would expect, or maybe hope, that it would be very stereotypical. So first function, second function, third function, fourth function, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, in the way that it's usually portrayed in the one and wholly perfect theory, which is probably not correct, or at least doesn't describe people in the way they've developed and expressed the functions. And I should mention, this is not actually heretical in any way. John Beebe, who talks about all the time the 8 functions, says that the numbering system is purely for referential convenience, and that doesn't actually say anything about more or less development or use. And what he emphasizes are the roles that the functions play. So we get this picture, and the end result across all of the 16 types is, what is it? It's one is that there is not one perfect stacking. In fact, for each type, there are 2 pretty big clusters, each cluster containing many thousands of people that have responded the same way. And one cluster I call like the analytic cluster, and the other cluster for a type I call the holistic cluster. And sometimes, like with INTJ, which we'll talk about in a moment, 2/3 of INTJs are like the analytic version, but 1/3 of the holistic version. And this is still like thousands of people responding the same way. NI is first, and then TE, and then like what comes afterwards. And it isn't something that's just like everybody follows the same thing. And I would say, even besides these 2 clusters, this still only covers about 85% of people. So there's still going to be 1 in 6 people that will be just their own weirdo developed path.
Yeah, so there is an analytic cognitive function stack and a holistic cognitive function stack that we'll be going over for each of the types. And so I'm excited to hear. And yeah, when I interviewed John Beebe, he talked about how the function stack is qualitative, not quantitative. So it's not meant to be going down the stack in terms of strength. Like, it's actually meant to represent archetypes at different spaces. And so, yeah, which fits Carl Jung's work a lot, because Carl Jung talks a lot about archetypes in general. So, yeah, and in the function stackings that we'll be talking about, it's about skillful usage and what the types report as skillful usage. So, all right, and so we'll start with INTJ, and I'm curious if you can let us know a little bit about the analytic function stacking for this type?
Yeah, absolutely. So of these two clusters of INTJ, one of them, which I'm calling sort of the analytic cluster, is basically just specializing in intuiting thinking. Like they just see whether it's introverted intuiting, extroverted intuiting, introverted or extroverted thinking. They're just like, yes, I do this. Yeah, I do this pretty well. Yeah, I do this pretty well. The stuff that's their opposite type is a little bit in the middle. Um, and then the stuff that they're weakest at are the stuff that we would expect them to be weak at. So like introverted sensing, extroverted feeling. So what is this then? It's like very much like, yeah, okay, they're specializing in general and intuiting and thinking, but they're very much like a classic stereotypical INTJ. And they are 2/3 of INTJs. And so this is many thousands of people responding the same way. They don't do well with social norms. They don't necessarily pay attention to or care that much about people's feelings. Um, they do have a decently strong sense of right and wrong, but where their most of their attention is going is effectiveness in the workplace, especially a typical workplace, but where they can use analytical skills, strategy, problem solving. If needed and when needed, they're going to do brainstorming and discussion. And they're the kind of INTJ that's going to be like, I don't know. Like I could be like INTP or maybe ENTJ. Like it's a little bit hard to say which one they might be because they're pretty good at intuiting and thinking regardless. Even though they're going to do well in the workplace, most workplaces filling that analytical or strategy problem solving role, they're actually not very still going to fit with standard operating procedures and conventions. And, don't put them in an insurance company unless their role is to innovate. They're still INTJs. Don't put them in people facing jobs at all. Because extroverted feeling as a skill set that surrounds like this underlying extroverted feeling consciousness or energy, like that's the worst thing for them. They're not going to enjoy that at all. So it's very much like the standard INTJ, and that is 2/3 of them.
Yeah. And so there's also the holistic INTJ, and I'm curious about how that looks like in comparison.
Hmm. So the holistic INTJ, and I'm thinking of someone in particular as an example, and the way she describes it is she's like, and she's definitely INTJ, like very much like part of the type community and all of that. And she's like, I really learned to do extroverted feeling at an early age. She's like, I have a lot of FJ friends as a woman. Like I'm encouraged and like essentially role modeled all the time. There's expectations of having skillful use of extroverted feeling. This doesn't mean it's her preference or she really likes it that much, but it's there. Um, and she's also very busy in her life, having to do things, both organizing things, yes, but the actual doing, like as a worker and as a student and as a mother and as a daughter, and like all of these different roles and different activities. Um, and then where it ends up weekly is going to be the self-care stuff. And we'll get back to that in a moment, but what is weak is the self-care kinds of things. So how this version comes off, which is 1/3 of INTJs, they're a little bit more fun-loving, they're more active, they're more effusive, like they're pretty open to ideas, they're much better with people, the far more, maybe not super outgoing, but personable. It's like, oh right, yes, let me switch to you and like pay attention to what's going on with you. Not necessarily emotional, but although they can talk about emotions, is just more personable. Um, Still good analytic skills, not amazing, not as strong as the classic INTJ, but still they have that. Um, and definitely they still do not jive, either of them, with conventional cultural norms, standard operating procedures, all of that. I think that they have more a sense of like, is this interesting? Is this engaging? This person or this idea? And if it is, let me engage with that in this moment. So maybe a little bit more leaning into their opposite type, but really it's about the sort of surprise of, yeah, they have some extroverted feeling skill. And for those of you listening say like, no, that's not possible, like that's their seventh function, it's supposed to be way down there, I'll tell you that up through the 90s and early 2000s, the so-called seventh function was considered actually oftentimes the actual third function, and vice versa. That Naomi Quank, who is a psychologist and very top person in the type community in the 1970s and 80s, with books like Beside Ourselves, and where she talked about like being caught in the shadow and the shadow self and all of that. She very much was like, no, I see a lot of patients and clients, and INTJs are better at FE, at least as a skill set, than at least some of them than they might think they are. I think the reason is because there's an element of like, okay, I need to step up and learn how to do this. And it many times is actually coming at a cost for the person, that their introverted feeling and their introverted sensing, which are both functions about self-care. What is comfortable? What do I feel? What do I need? Like those actually get neglected because there's more of a focus of the external world. And this holistic INTJ can pull off looking more extroverted. If I had to choose between these two myself, like, well, I know from brain imaging also, I'm the more holistic version of it. Yeah, I do NINTE, but I also do extroverted sensing. I am not spending all of my time taking care of kids, and I generally work for myself. So I feel like I get to do my FE or FI a little bit stronger, and maybe I don't need to FE as much. But no, I'm aware of it. Like as I get older, like the self-care thing is important. Um, so that's like 1/3 of INTJs. Analytic, holistic. The analytic version is specializing being an NT. They could be mistaken for ENTJ or INTP, and maybe even ISTP or ISTJ. Not so much ISTJ, because the moment you scratch the surface, they're like, no, 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 to these like conventions. They're just very good at analytic strategy, problem solving. And then the holistic version is much more likely to be in the arts, to be in social service, to be in a much more like people oriented way. So they're the INTJ who can be a counselor, for example, or can be in theater or something like that. And they still have their analytical skills, and they're still countercultural, but they're just more, they're going to be mistaken for like INFJ, maybe even INFP. Um, and it will be so that's how we see that, show up, is like, what else could they possibly be, or until they learn about type or they get to their best fit.
Yeah. And so the first variant of INTJ, like you said, is very NT. They're good at their NITE, TI, and their NE as well.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, it's going to give them that analytic feel, especially because of the thinking functions that are also in, like, that they prefer too. It creates an extra
Mhm.
masculinity to it.
Mhm.
Whereas for the holistic side, it's the INTJ who leans a little bit more on their extroverted functions, whether it's SE or FE or some other one. They've almost grown into their inner ISFP.
Mm, yeah,
Yeah.
and then yet at the same time, I believe that probably it's the reason why extroverted feeling shows up in terms of skillful use is because they have all these societal and social demands that are there, like the different roles that they have to play at work and in the family and all of that, and they don't have a lot of time for self-care. I think in interviewing them, you talk about like what's important for you, like that can come up privately, but in terms of day to day, they don't have a lot of room in their life to do that. And so I think that's where it is. And then ultimately, yeah, they are more extroverted and more holistic, like open to different things and be more adaptable, but still the introverted sensing is not strong. So they're adapting in some ways externally to society, but internally, no. That still is like that's true for both versions of INTJ, is the introverted sensing is just not there not their cup of tea.
Yeah, I can see that. So that covers up 85% of the variation of cognitive stacking
Yes.
for INTJs. I'm curious about the outlier cases that you've seen. So, like, what
Mhm.
are some people who are definitely INTJs in your opinion, but like maybe a rogue stacking that you find sometimes that
A
people.
rogue stacking. Oh, I love that term. Thank you. That's cute. I have not combed through the data to see what like. So these are two large clusters, but there's some mini clusters that are very small, like maybe a couple percentage of INTJs compared to these big ones. Um, and what would they look like exactly? I'm not sure, but I do think that there is a version, and this is actually one which I just did a brain imaging session with yesterday, where the extroverted sensing and particularly the introverted feeling are quite strong, along with the introverted intuiting. So he's INTJ, but a yoga teacher, and general, like, does mystical kind of stuff, but is also very physical in his activities. Does he still live in his head? Far more than, say, an ISFP would. But when we look at the actual skill development, he's not stretching into extroverted feeling. He's very clear on like the introverted feeling. So it would be, I would say, like introverted intuiting, and he knows type, extroverted thinking, um, some introverted thinking and introverted feeling, both going along with it, and extroverted sensing. And where he has a lot of difficulty is extroverted intuiting,
Mm.
the sort of like NESI, like this idea of working in a company, like he's like literally not capable of it. Like it does, I mean, it can work at like some kinds of jobs, but just basically like has to be self-employed because he's just not capable of that. And when it comes to that NE, like extemporaneous expression of ideas, and like, I'll bring, this person said this and that person said that, like let's weave that together in something and add to it that's funny or whatever. Nope, like completely freezes in that moment. So I think that that's a version which is particularly connected with, um, like the introverted feeling and introverted intuiting together. And then what doesn't work out is both like they're not super analytical and strategic in terms of a job. They can sort of do it for themselves. They're not people oriented, but they do have a physicality to them and like a clarity of personal purpose and willpower. And so that's like, I think, a third, like much less common version.
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah, especially the being a yoga instructor really changes how your stacking shows up in the nurture element of it. So
Mhm.
he had to flex into that. Yeah, and the commonality between all INTJs is that they lead with introverted intuition. And
Mhm.
even if his FI and SC are stronger than the typical INTJ, they're still all serving ultimately the hero, which is the introverted intuition. So,
Yes, yeah, and in fact, we were having a discussion about how, not this year or last year, but a couple of years before that, the NI just like completely took over his whole life, in a sort of classic INTJ, like I want to say like obsessive pursuit or tunnel vision of a creative project, into the point where like he even stopped working and was just working on this one thing continuously,
yeah.
like day after day, like all day long. And then of course became like completely and totally burned out. And as he described, like basically went nuts from it for a while before he had to like completely reset and like completely step away from all of that. Learned a lot in the process, but yeah, sometimes the hero does a little bit too much.
Mm. Sometimes the hero is seen as the hammer that is hitting every nail or the problem they're facing.
Yes. Yeah.
So, yeah. Yeah. The INTJs can get very sucked into this like NIFI creative project that they're doing and what they like, and then funnel all their energy into that
Hmm.
vision completion. And so we're gonna go to INFJ next. But first, we want to talk to you a little bit about the retreat that we're holding called Young for Life. It's going to be in New York City and Chicago later this year. And the details are down below in the description. This is where Dario will dive into active imagination and yoga and shamanism and teach you about what Carl Jung really valued and to immerse yourself in other Jungian concepts besides type. We'll also be talking about type because it'll be a bunch of personality type lovers there,
Yeah.
but you'll learn an even more expansive tool set in your Jungian tool belt. And so, for instance, Carl Jung talked a lot about the mind body connection and how that's a tool for individuation. And so, we'll be doing a lot of that experiential learning in this retreat. Not to mention that I'll be there and Dario will be there. And so, you'll get a lot of amazing time with us. But yeah, Dario, do you have anything to add?
Hmm. Yeah, I just I want to say a few things. I mean, you sort of emphasize that it's experiential learning, and yet it's also still very much Jungian at the same time. Like Jung did actually not talk a huge amount about type. Even psychological types, only one chapter is about the types. Um, and a lot of the inspiration, influence, and his interests were around like, yes, the archetypes, we've talked about that. Active imagination is a technique to work with the archetypes in the self. Yoga, he gave talks on yoga, went to India, was very much inspired by yoga concepts. Shamanism, when he came to the United States and the Navajo reservation, and working with Navajo shaman there, learning from him. And so there really is, I just want to bring this element that's very experiential, and yet also has like the strong, like very nice Jungian foundation to it. So that people have this sense of like, even in just 2.5 days of immersing and coming out of that, really feeling like they had an amazing experience of getting in touch more with themselves and others. And in the last day, like the last half of the day, will be like discussing type, and bringing type more into it as well as along the way. And folks get lunch, and we're keeping it smallish. So these are, each one is limited to 14 people. Also really trying to keep the cost down, even though, of course, like we have to find a place. I mean, we have places that are wonderful places that these will be held. Um, so I would encourage people to come and take a look at it. And there also is like a certain number of slots that are for like students or those in financial need. So if that is an issue for you, let me know. But yeah, Chicago, very easy to access. New York City, it's right across the river from Manhattan. And they're lovely venues, and it's a chance to really connect with fellow Jung lovers and type lovers, as well as meeting Joyce and myself.
Thank you, Dario, for that. And that brings us to INFJ. I'm curious to hear a little bit about this first variation of INFJ.
Yeah, absolutely. So as with INTJ, 5 out of 6 people seem to group into these two broad clusters with many thousands of people ranking the functions in the same order. And this version is interesting. It's, yes, introverted intuiting and extroverted feeling, as we're expecting. And then there also is extroverted intuiting and introverted feeling. So we see this where it's like the person's basically specializing in being an NF, and they're also bringing in some extroverted sensing with it. And you're like, okay, so what does that look like? And I would say, think of all of the INFJs you've encountered who are in the arts, performing arts, graphic arts, fine arts, music, whatever it is. They're in a world, like a sort of professional world, which is a mix of working with people and working with ideas. And it could be the INFJ who starts a yoga studio that also offers classes in dance and painting, and bringing in like sound bowls and other forms of creative expression and storytelling and poetry. And so they're very much like, I'm NF, and don't put them and sit them down in front of a computer program and expect that they're going to do computer coding. But if you put them in a studio with some, say, SFPs or SFJs, some other NF types, they're going to be like, yeah, these are my folks. And so they can be mistaken for INFP, maybe even sort of some other like sensing feeling types. They might look like those. And ENFJ, of course, they could look like that as well. And even with a fairly strong extrovert intuiting, they might even think in that first pass of like learning about type, they'll be like, oh gosh, am I like NFJ or NFP? And I could be even ENFP. Like, gosh, I don't know. So they have like this caring, attentive, go with the flow, mystical, creative. What they're generally not good at, with the weakest functions, introverted sensing. So they're not going to get along with like a standard organizational environment, where you're clocking in and you're doing accounting and all of that. And then the analytical skills, the thinking skills, extroverted thinking, introverted thinking, also not good. So they're going to be the kind of INFJ who's like, yeah, I have such like an amazing vision for my studio. And when people come in, they have a great time and they learn so much. And they're like, but I just can't seem to do the marketing part of it well, or the business part. And so that's, again, where that difficulty is. So they're really specializing NF with some extroverted sensing. And then the rest of it sort of falls by the wayside. And there's a very creative, effusive version of INFJ.
It's like the TE may not always be there, and that they struggle with getting it done and marketing themselves, and the common creative struggle of the practical part of it.
Yeah. And don't expect them to be in a TESI environment or even in a TISI environment. They're not the version of INFJ that's going to be buddy with an INTP, for example. At least not the standard version of INTP, because they're like, wow, this person's like way too analytical for me. Although, as we're going to discuss when we get to INTPs, there's also like a holistic version of INTP. So that's another story.
And so I'm curious about the other version of INFJ. How does that look
Mm.
like?
So that other version of INFJ is very much, as we saw with INTJ, pretty good with multiple functions, ones that are needed to survive in everyday society. So NI and FE, yes. And they can do some extroverted thinking, some extroverted sensing, some extroverted intuiting, some introverted thinking. They're sort of leaning into their opposite type. I like to say like ISTP or ESTP. They can do pretty well with analytical skills. They're decent at taking action. That doesn't mean the analytical skills are things that are going to fit in very well to like standard operating procedures or cultural norms, but they do know how to detach from their own personal feelings. And a necessary, like, okay, what do we need to do in the situation in order to better run our business? And they're going to do better in business. They're going to do much better with technical material than the other version of INFJ. You're going to be like, okay, yeah, like here's like some computer code. I can actually take this computing class and like learn all of this stuff. Organizational structure, as long as it's like conceptual in nature and not like a taskmaster, they're going to do fine with that. So a much more, I want to say like businessy version or analytical version of INFJ that could easily score as INTJ, maybe even INTP or ISTP initially. But I think that there's a fair number of INFJs who wonder, am I INFJ or INTJ? The other version of the holistic INFJs being like, am I like INFJ or INFP? They're going to think maybe I'm a thinking type, or maybe even a sensing type. But that's what this version looks like. And they are literally half of many thousands of INFJs really gave like the same stack of responses. That yes, introverted intuiting is first, and I do extroverted feeling. And then after that, like there's this analytical and organizational stuff and engagement with the world and taking action and ideas and calculating things and being pretty good at business and technical material.
Yeah, so this is the INFJ that can TE, that can organization well,
Mhm.
that can do the practical, pragmatic stuff if they need to.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's a great example where, again, most type descriptions are going to emphasize the holistic INFJ, the first one we talked about. And in doing that, often actually underestimate the holistic's capacity to do extroverted sensing within the arts and the social activity. Um, and then oftentimes type descriptions completely miss this analytic version of INFJ, unless that description really takes time to dig into introverted thinking. And remember, right, and that there's a look, oh yeah, there's also social pressure to role play extroverted thinking. And that's what they're doing. They're role playing extroverted thinking.
They can do the extroverted thinking, the social function. I feel like a lot of environments require TJs and FJs to develop their social function, their TE or FE in general to
Yeah,
function.
yeah. And I would say that the times that I've worked in organizations, there's, as a TJ type, there are moments when I'm under stress or sort of like pushed to a certain point where I'm like, yeah, I'm done with this FJ role play. Like, I'm just going to say what's on my mind. Those never turn out well. Probably because I needed to use extroverted intuiting instead. It was like saying something funny in the moment that also reaches people in sort of a magical way. But I'm not great at that myself. So I think it's really fair to ask people and to think about, like, how do you use the functions for you? How have you learned to express them or role play them? And not feel that they have to follow this exact linear structure. And like I said, that structure underneath, when we think about roles that the functions play, as John Beebe has described, that may be still completely legitimate model. And for the most part, it is what I see. But in terms of skillful use, that's another story. I'm just amazed at INTJs I meet who just can't follow along with extroverted intuiting. I'm like, come on, guys, it's like not that complicated. I remember when I was bad at it, but at some point I just hung around with enough NFPs. I was like, okay, this is how it is. And I think it can be learned. I really do. I remember as an undergraduate, I hated professors who did too much introverted thinking. I'm like, this is madness. Like, you can't even complete one example. You're just like preaching about a principle. And then by the time I got my PhD, I'm like, oh no, like introverted thinking is like super powerful as long as you have the right principles. In any situation, you can use it. Um, which is really cool. So I would say, like, these are just reminder to give people a break, all of the types, and know that we all can develop in different ways.
Well said. The functions can be learned because we're adaptable creatures in general.
Mhm.
Yeah, especially if your friends have certain functions, like, I find that sometimes people have trouble typing themselves because they're taking on attributes of, let's say, their husband or their workmates, and so there's social contagion is a real thing.
Yeah, yeah, and it's because, and we've talked about this in a previous video, how how the culture emphasizes three functions in particular: extroverted thinking, extroverted feeling, and introverted sensing. And if you have one of those three, great. If you have two of them, great. But still, everybody of every type is pushed to role play those to some extent. And that's just some people are like, no, I'm just absolutely going to refuse to do it, which means they're not going to be working in like classic organizational life, the business world, whatever it is. They're going to be in some other more personalized space, or I want to say like a countercultural space. But it also is a good reminder, as we're talking about INTJ and INFJ, that their dominant function, NI, is very different from introverted sensing, which is very, one of the top three in the population.
Mm,
Um, Now, John Beebe references Jung in talking about what an NI and SI have in common. What they have in common is what Jung called the religious function, that they're both concerned in a deep way with spiritual questions. That doesn't mean that that's the only thing that they're about. It's like, what do they have in common? Because it's not like they're completely separate. They do have an overlap or commonality, and the overlap is going to be religious and spiritual questions. And you can go to, let's say you go to church or synagogue, and there are INFJs there and there are ISFJs there. And they're there for very different reasons, and they're experiencing it very differently, but they're also both showing up. And if you ask each of them to talk about their religious or spiritual life, the INFJ and the ISFJ can both talk a lot about that from their dominant function. And I even believe, as people get older, seeing this with my dad as ISTJ, that eventually in very old age, the eighth function, and what seems like it's supposed to be so different, actually comes into our lives and becomes integrated. And that's maybe each person, it could be just this one special experience. It could be like a hobby or side practice that a person does. And I know it's not always easy for the younger INFJs and INTJs, especially because INFJ is even less common in the population than INTJ. INTJs, especially male INTJs, they're like, yeah, I can pretend I can fit in with extroverted thinking. So it's not easy, but do know that actually you do have something in common with the more populous part of the population, and that really each of the stacks after the first function is really an attempt by the first function to figure out how to get itself to like actually have success and satisfaction in life. And I think that's a powerful way to think of it. It's not just like this lone journey. Oh, you have a dominant functions, you need to balance it out with the secondary. And then you have like a third and fourth, which are the opposite. Like nobody goes through life thinking about those things in such detail. I mean, unless they, like, I don't know, they've really studied type. Like then they're like type maven, type grandmaster. But really what it is a person has this dominant function, and then they have these resources in life, role models, as you mentioned, like a parent, romantic partner, best friends, what the culture is encouraging, what the media shows, also the things that are not there and not supported. And they're like, okay, which of these other functions am I going to like bring in and try and get some skillful use of in order for my dominant function to actually be heroic and satisfied? And to me, that's like a very organic way of thinking about type, and a much more Jungian way of thinking about type.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. So thank you, Dario, for grounding us in a more Jungian understanding of type. And so if you've liked today's episode, we're creating a series on all the types and their cognitive function stack. So stay tuned on that. And so, yeah, thank you. And we'll see you all in the next episode.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye.